Coffee, big cup, and hello. Welcome back to another episode of the Gilmore Way Podcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Laura. This week, we're diving into the portrayal of journalism on the show. We learn early on that Rory has ambitions of being a foreign correspondent and is very inspired by Christiane Amanpour. We see her writing for her school papers at Chilton and Yale, and it becomes a big part of her arc, especially in seasons 5 and 6. But the portrayal of her journalistic capabilities throughout the show leaves a little bit to be desired, and we definitely have thoughts about whether it was the right career path for her, which is what we're going to start talking about tonight. We also have an episode planned to talk about her internship at the Stamford Eagle Gazette, her career in the revival, as well as an entire episode about how Mitchum Huntsberger totally had her clocked in season 5. But for this week, we're going to focus on her time with the school papers at Chilton and Yale.
Indeed. Heads up, we are a spoilers all podcast. We will be talking about the entire show. We'll be bouncing back and forth in time. So if you don't want to know what happens in later seasons, go watch them and then come back and watch this. And if you could please quickly do all those YouTube-y things. They're fast, they're free, they really help us out. Hit that like button, drop us a comment, share this video with your friends. And without further ado, let's get talking about Chilton, the Franklin. Obviously, we have Rory in the second episode telling the headmaster that her aspiration is to go to Harvard to study journalism and political science on her way to being Christiane Amanpour. And, he, of course, is just like, you don't want to be Cokie Roberts, not Oprah, Rosie, or one of the women from The View. And so we get her explanation that she wants to do what she does. She wants to be a foreign correspondent. She wants to travel, see things close up, report on things on the ground, be a part of something big. And Charleston calls her out on it, and it's just like, so you have to be on TV to do something big, to be a part of something big? Why not be like part of a police chase? A little bit ridiculous, Charleston, but all right. So she's like, maybe I'll be a journalist, write books or articles. I just want to be sure that I see something. And so I totally get that. But what did you think about her explanation and her rationale for all of that?
It's good for a young person and someone of Rory's age at that time to have those aspirations. But and I'm going into this with hindsight's 2020, but also knowing how things pan out for her down the line and in the decades to come. For as much as it was good for her to have those desires and for her to want to have that career path, she had no clue what it would actually take to make that a successful reality and a career for her. And I think Charleston probably, maybe as an academic, obviously he was the headmaster of the school, maybe needed to push back a little bit harder even than he did at the time, as if to say, do you really understand how tough of a path that is for you to take? And we see it, and we'll talk about it when she's writing for the Franklin. It's like, you're writing about concrete parking lots, which is great. But when you get into the real world, you're going to be writing about subjects that are really heavy, that are a lot more prevalent in society, that need to be handled with care and given the research and the intensity and the time and the diligence that they're owed. I don't think Rory, in her Chilton years, even writing for the Franklin and in that moment in time in Charleston's office, really knew what the career path that she was trying to pursue was actually going to entail and what it was going to take for her to be successful in that regard. And ultimately, I think it was because of her lack of understanding of that why she ended up failing a lot in the years to come at Yale and post-Yale, which we'll talk about.
Yeah. Obviously, we'll dig a little deeper into that when we talk about how Mitchum Huntsberger was right about her. As perhaps blunt as he might have been in that moment, he caught on to that. And yeah, it also goes to what Jess said to her at the end of season 2, what are your big ambitions? And she says she wants to be Christiane Amanpour. And he's like, you're going to crawl around in trenches and stand on top of buildings and have bombs going off in the background and wars raging all around you. And he's like, it just sounds a little too rough for you. And she says, it's not a little too rough for me. I hope it's not a little too rough for me. I've been talking about this forever. I mean, I don't even know what I would do if, and she just trails off, because even at that point, she has no idea of what a plan B would be. And that's not great. It's a little scary to contemplate. The fact that she's wanted to be a journalist since she was 4 or whatever it was, that she was just so locked into this so young, and the fact that she couldn't even conceptualize other options for herself, I think hemmed her in and limited her unnecessarily. And we'll talk again more about that when we do the episode about the revival and kind of her mentality later on, as the journalism stuff is not going as she hoped. But it was kind of telegraphed to us very early on that this was not maybe going to go exactly to plan for her. And Rory is not the kind of person who deals well with uncertainty or with changes in plans. She's a little too rigid. And so we see these seeds planted early. The writing is on the wall from at least the end of season 2. And so it's kind of interesting to watch that progress as the show moves along. But yeah. I have a question. Maybe you have thought about this more than I have, but we know Paris is the editor of the Franklin in season 2. Mm-hmm. So what do you think the deal is with that paper? Like, is it only for juniors and seniors? Why isn't a senior the editor of the paper? How did she get this job? Is it sophomore to senior, junior to senior? Like, it makes no sense to me that Paris, of all people, would get this job when she's not even sort of like as experienced as maybe other people on the paper. There must be seniors on there who have been on the paper before who could do a better job. And I mean, obviously she's not a primary character the same way Rory is in season 1. And so maybe we don't know if she was working on the paper that year and Rory just missed out on joining because she came in late. But like, if she's new to the paper, how does she get to be the editor? I don't understand. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it surprises me as much as it does for you, because, I mean, I feel like this is probably a paper that was open from, like, freshmen to seniors. Like, if you want to contribute and you have good quality material and you want to be a part of, the Franklin, like, join the team, and I hate calling on this, but you also have to remember, like, Chilton has students like Tristan Dugray. I'm sure, he was not alone in, like, just getting that type of student. But you even see, like, Madeline and Louise are on the paper. And, like, yeah, they're there, but they're just like, can we talk about corduroy pants sometimes? Like, the level of intensity and the dedication that you would need from an editor of this paper was probably not something that you were going to find in every single Chilton student. You probably had to really go digging for it. And so maybe the teacher that was supervising this paper just recognized Paris is a go-getter. She obviously wants it. She's going to be dedicated. She's going to be focused. She's going to give the paper her all. I'm going to let her take on this role in this position because no one has the gravitas that she does and the passion for it. So even though she is only a junior at that point, maybe there were not any seniors who just had that interest or had that, like, level of desire that Paris did. So it doesn't really faze me that it was given to her. It kind of actually tracks because she probably also just was in that teacher's office every day at like 3:05 being like, so, heard there, in 2 years, the current editor is going to, be graduating. So I know I'm only a freshman now, but in 2 years when I'm a junior, who are you going to give it to? It's going to be me, right? It's going to be Paris Geller. Like, I could see outtakes of that in my head because that's just who she is. She was probably gunning for it from day one at Chilton, and she was not going to accept anything less than running this paper. So it totally fits for me that that's where this ended up.
Yeah, I'm not 100% surprised by it. I just have been part of clubs like this before, and it's like it's not usually the underclassmen who are running the show. Usually they get the most senior person to do it. I mean, granted, not always the case. I mean, even with Yale, Doyle doesn't step down from his editorship until the middle of season 6, basically. And, that would make him the editor from like his sophomore year or something, which is kind of wild. But yeah, absolutely. Paris has the capabilities and the tenacity to hound the teacher. I think it's Mrs. O'Malley is the teacher that oversees the Franklin. And so yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if she was lobbying for it forever. But I don't know. It's just one of those things where it feels like people's ages and standings relative to other people are rarely taken into consideration. And it's just sort of like, well, we need to make Paris the editor to create tension with her and Rory, because like now she's kind of Rory's boss, right? And so it's, they should be on equal footing grade wise, and there should be an upperclassman who should be running the show at that point. It would have made more sense to me if there was maybe a competition between them in season 3 for it, or like leading up to season 3, as opposed to the whole school council thing. Not that I didn't like the school council subplot, but the Francie stuff was a little overdone. I know a lot of people feel that plotline didn't have a lot of teeth to it. I mean, I loved Emily Bergel and I thought she was hilarious. She's in for a major bikini wax. Like that was great. And all the President's Men references were well done. But I feel like it would have hit harder if that was at the paper, because it would have hit closer to Rory's true interests and like, what she's relying on her transcript to get her into a school to study journalism. You know what I mean? It might have been an interesting subplot to have them a little more at odds with that, instead of somehow having Paris be Rory's superior almost right away. So I don't know. It was just a thought I had where I was just like, something about this doesn't feel quite right. Usually a junior would not get that job. There must have been someone who was there longer than her and who was at least equally as capable.
Maybe, but also Paris probably cornered them in the bathroom and was just like, don't. Or I will make your senior year miserable at Chilton. Relinquish it now. And I could see her instilling the fear of like the newspaper gods into whoever was supposed to take on that, and just being like, yep, nope, don't want that. Like, don't care about it as much. It's Paris Geller. It doesn't surprise me. She
That's
has
fair.
like she'll put the fear in you to do it. She wanted it. She got it. Tracks for me.
She even says it in the Lorelai's first day at Chilton. She's like, I'm going to be the editor of the Franklin next year. And I'm like, how do you know that right now? Like, yeah, maybe it was a targeted
people in bathrooms.
Yeah, maybe it was a targeted campaign. It could be. It just feels like a writing contrivance, and you know how I feel about those. But anyway, moving on. We don't see Rory at the Franklin until Nick and Nora sit in Nancy. So like just into season 2. And obviously Paris tricks her and has her show up late. And by virtue of that, Rory gets the crappy assignment of writing about the repaving of the faculty parking lot. And Rory, turns it into an opportunity to write a stirring article about, how everything eventually becomes obsolete. And then she gets, praised by Mrs. O'Malley, and, it backfires on Paris. But then once again, Paris is just like, I can keep driving this knife deeper and deeper. And so now that she's proven herself and I have to give her something better, I'm going to give her the interview with Max Medina, because I can tell that something is awkward there now. So what did you think about Rory's interview and article with Max?
I think she handled it as gracefully as she could have, but I think she honestly could have done better. I know that's a tricky situation for her, and obviously it's an awkward one considering what's going on between her mother and Max. But I think she needed to, and she probably could have done a better job at separating a potential, stepfather figure as opposed to like a teacher. I think she let Paris live rent free in her head a little bit too much on that one. You probably just needed to shut that off and do better with that interview. But considering that Paris was, doing what she was doing at that point in time, which even Lorelai was just like, wow, what a gem that one to do that to you. I think she did the best job that she could with it. And it was good of her to not let Paris completely dissuade her from like being a part of the paper, just acknowledging that like, yeah, sometimes you're going to get assignments that are uncomfortable. I mean, we'll talk about it, but Doyle does it to her at the Yale Daily News. Sometimes you're going to have to write about things that are not, fitting for you, that are an actual challenge. If you can't hack it, maybe don't be a part of the paper. I mean, Doyle says it to her. Again, there's so much more to talk about there. We'll get to it. But you have to have backbone in this job and in this career. And I think it was inadvertently maybe Paris just sort of like, she was doing it to her, and she obviously was not doing it with the sense of like, get that backbone. But it would have been it should have been a good learning phase for Rory to understand, like, yeah, sometimes you're going to have to write about things that you don't want to. It's the job. Do it. Put aside your emotions, put aside your personal feelings, and write the article that you need to write.
Yeah.
We're sitting here looking at a 17-year-old expecting her to do that, considering what is going on, but maybe just, it was something that she needed to learn.
Yeah, and she does kind of stand up to Paris and says, like, no matter how many crappy assignments you give me, I'm not going to back down. You can't force me out here. At the end of my time here, it's going to say on my transcript that I wrote for the Franklin. And, again, I admire that. She's not going to let Paris bully her out of anything. But that attitude doesn't seem to extend very long or past Paris. Like, there's something about Paris, I think, that, like, Rory feels like she's able to go toe-to-toe with Paris a little more confidently than other people. She kind of kowtows to Doyle and then absolutely falls apart when Mitchum criticizes her even a little bit. The backbone is selective, unfortunately, and it goes to the point that maybe she doesn't have the grit at the end of the day for this job. If you can only stand up to one person because of your personal history with them, and you feel like how to manage them, that's not enough to get you through all of the tribulations that you're going to face in a job like this. So I think she either lost some confidence somewhere along the way, or it was only situational to begin with. Like, it was easy enough to go up against Paris in this sort of like controlled environment. Charleston refers to it as, privileged at some point. And yeah, he's absolutely right about that. It sort of seems like she's not able to continue with that mentality and continue to stand up for herself maybe in the way that she needs to, which is not good. Like, I think ahead a little bit to application anxiety when she's put in contact with Darren Springsteen, and like, she can't even talk to him on the phone about setting up a lunch to ask about Harvard. And I'm like, you want to be a foreign correspondent and you can't even make a phone call? I mean, I can't make a phone call, but I don't want to be a foreign correspondent. I know my limits, okay? So again, yeah, writing is on the wall with her that like, this is maybe not for her. She doesn't have that grit and that willingness to dig ceaselessly, to get what she needs, get in, get out, and get the story. We see it over and over and over again.
Yeah, and I think even from her Charlton days, Rory was very much a person who just expected to write an article and maybe even have it just be praised all around. And it just goes to what Mitchum sees in her, what Doyle sees in her. She was never, I think, expecting what she was writing to be criticized. She was just expecting, you know, I wrote this, I rewrote this 4 times. I did all my homework. I did all my research. Why isn't this good? And sometimes it's just not going to be, but she was never open to just hearing that or responding to it. She took it as a personal failure, and she needed not to, because that's never how you're going to grow as a writer. But I think it's also another reason why this career path was never the right one for her, because you can't go into it thinking that you're just going to be successful right off the bat. There has to be that growth period. And I don't think that she ever envisioned that for herself. She just envisioned success right off the bat without any problems whatsoever. And I mean, again, Charleston, Doyle, like Mitch, like there are so many characters that I think see that it's not right for her. And I think we see it too. But journalism was not the career for Rory. And it was because that she was always expecting to be just having her work noticed as perfect and without any sort of need for revision or change. And when you can't be receptive to that sort of criticism, again, just it wasn't the right path for her. I think there are other paths that she could have taken in terms of being like a good editor, in terms of being in a leadership position. And we'll talk about that too. But I don't think she was ever built to sit behind the desk and write well, because she just couldn't. And that was noticed. But she couldn't ever accept that.
Yeah. I mean, we do see her as the Yale Daily News editor, and I think she does a pretty good job with that. I actually kind of feel like maybe she's at her best when she's running that paper. She seems her happiest and most confident as she's rebounding from the whole Mitchum situation. And we can tell that she's got good skills for dealing with people, for delegating, for critiquing their writing in a way that makes it better without making them feel bad about themselves. And yeah, she has a good demeanor for that. But that's not the only part of journalism. The other side of it is that going out, getting your hands a little dirty, being part of the action. It's that conversation she has with Logan in You Jump, I Jump, Jack, when he's like, all the greats got in there and they, Ernie Pyle got so deep into World War II, he was killed by a Japanese sniper, and that's not Rory. She doesn't have that same tenacity to go out and be a part of the action, which makes the foreign correspondent side of things especially a bad fit for her. And I do think she's a great writer, but there's a difference between being a great writer and being a great journalist, and also between being a great writer and being a great editor, and being a great editor and being a great journalist. There's all these different things at play, and she's got some of it, but not some of the other stuff. But she's never willing to reconsider any of this. She's like, nope, this is the path and I'm sticking to it.
Yep. Do you think that there was anything that Paris could have done within those Chilton years to prepare her better for that career path? Considering that obviously Paris was in a leadership role. Rory was going to go to Yale, which we'll talk about why that may or may not have been the best choice either. But was there anything that Paris could have done better during those junior and senior years to better prepare Rory? Should we have expected that from Paris? Was it her obligation to do so? I guess my question is, could have and should have Rory been better prepared going into a college journalism path than she was?
She could have. I don't know that Paris would have been the right person to do that for her. Paris, for all of her talents and skills, is Rory's peer. They're very much kind of on the same level. And while there are moments that Paris does provide valuable insight and wisdom to Rory, especially when it comes to like, you have to do more than just have good grades to get into Harvard. She is giving her some information that she knows about stuff like that. But journalism is also not Paris's desired path. She wants to be a doctor or a lawyer or both, and so journalism is more just a hobby or a passion for her. It's not what she ultimately intends to pursue. And so I don't know that she has the experience or insight that would help Rory. And even, like the teacher who helps them run the Franklin, maybe she doesn't have enough experience either. She needed to maybe ask for connections to someone who's actually working as a journalist somewhere somehow to get insights from somebody who's boots on the ground. I don't think Paris either had the expertise nor the demeanor to give Rory that kind of advice. We see her leadership style. She's not a good leader because she comes in and tries to control everything. There's something that's a disconnect with her where it's not her goal to go in and leave everybody better. It's not her goal to make people better at what they're doing other than by shaming them into compliance. She's not very effective, and that's why she's ultimately Howell Raines out of the Yale Daily News. So she's not the right person to do that for Rory. But speaking of that, how do you feel like Paris did overall as the Chilton paper editor at the Franklin? Like, thinking to, the times when she was pushing that team really hard. Is there anything that stands out about her time as editor there?
I think she actually did a good enough job for a high school paper. And I'll put the emphasis on for a high school paper. But I feel like a lot of the mistakes that we were seeing her make early on with the Franklin were mistakes that she continued to make within the Yale Daily News. Micromanagement, too much type A perfection, which is not always a bad thing. Like, I can be type A about things. I think to an extent, maybe all of us can at certain times, but she took it too far. And so I think there were a lot of really early like warning signs and red flags with how she was leading the Franklin that then translated to how she led the Yale Daily News when she was eventually made editor of that production or that publication. I think she was good at pushing the staff of both papers to want to do better and be better and write better, but she did it in a way that was just too overbearing, too big brother, too much, in her mindset, it's like, well, why don't I just write the paper in its entirety? Like, who even needs a staff? I'll just do all of it. It's a mistake that we see her make at the Yale Daily News when, Rory even confronts her and says, like, where you have 5 hours left and there's 100 hours worth of work here that you have outlined for yourself. What are you going to do? And she's like, I'll get it done. I think she did a good enough job with the Franklin for what that publication was and at a high school level. But in the same way that Rory needed to learn how to be a better journalist at a higher level, for Paris to be a better editor at a higher level, they both had so much to learn. And I don't think that Paris learned enough to transition from being a successful high school paper editor to a successful college level, university level paper editor-in-chief. It just was never there for her.
Yeah, micromanagement's definitely a good term. She's a fear-based leader. She got people to do what she wanted because they were afraid of her wrath. Like, hell hath no fury like Paris Geller.
Put that on a t-shirt.
I know, right? And just in general, her standards were way too high. I'm thinking of the episode where she's trying to go for the Oppenheimer Award. And I've got the quote here because it's just so funny. The Oppenheimer Award for Excellence in School Journalism is not a contest. It's a statement. It says you're the best writers, the best reporters, the best editors. It says that you have crushed all others who have dared to take you on. It says that every other single school in the United States of America is feeling nothing but shame and defeat and pain because of the people who won the Oppenheimer plaque. I want to be those people. I want to cause that pain. Like, again, the writing is on the wall for Paris and her attempts at leadership. Like, it really does feel like this is foreshadowing for all of the stuff at the Yale Daily News later. Anyone who thought Paris was going to do a great job at that wasn't paying enough attention in season 3. Like,
yeah, I agree. And again, but she never learns from it. And that's why we'll get to talking about it. But when she eventually gets ousted as editor from the Yale Daily News, it was for all of the same reasons and for all of the same flaws that I think we were noticing from her as editor of the Franklin. She wants to lead a team, but she can't. And I would almost say, like, again, Rory and Paris needed to really reverse roles, because I think Paris wanted to lead, but just didn't have the adequate capabilities to do so. She was much better just being allowed to perhaps even just write on her own and do that. And Rory wanted to be a journalist, but was actually not a good writer. And so, but when you put her in a leadership role, actually excels quite a bit of the time and fairly. And so I think you need to recognize what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are. And I think both Paris and Rory failed to realize that maybe I'm writing when I should actually be maybe just be supervising, or I'm supervising when I should be writing. And you can still bring really good qualities and really good efforts to the table, but just do it in a capacity that is good for you and that's warranted and that's good for the publication. And so I think that's where, with both Paris and Rory going from the Franklin into the Yale Daily News, they had a lot to learn, but they never really learned it.
I actually do think Rory was a good writer. I mean, obviously there might have been a few speeches or something where it's like, we never really hear what she writes. Everybody just tells us she's a good writer, or at least Lorelai does. But Lorelai thinks everything Rory does is perfect, so there's maybe a little bit of bias there. But, going back to the paving of the parking lot story, just the praise that she got from that leads me to believe that she is a capable writer. But there's a difference between, like, writing is just the last step of journalism, if you will. Like, that's taking what you've learned and putting the polish on it. And that's something she's strong at, but it's not enough to make her a great journalist. But as it pertains to Paris, I don't think Paris wanted to lead a team. She wanted to be in control. And there's a difference between those things. And I don't think she wanted to do it necessarily just for the sake of doing it, because she loved it or because it was important to her. I think she wanted the accolades. She wanted the visibility. She wanted the recognition. She wanted to achieve a lot of things at the expense, perhaps, of other people that she feels like she has to crush on her way to the top.
Yeah, but again, that's where you need to learn from that and learn why that's not okay. It's not about just stepping on the lesser person. It's about raising them up to kind of like meet you on your level. And that's where I think especially Paris really floundered, because instead of giving constructive criticism to her writers that were writing for her on the Yale Daily News and saying, like, let me correct and revise your writing and then just try again and bring me, a second edit, she was instantly just like, nope, this is garbage. I'll just rewrite the whole thing myself. And that's why Paris never made a good editor, because she wouldn't allow for any sort of betterment or revision. It was just, if you can't do it right the first time, just go and I will just do it myself.
Yeah. We definitely see that from her, where she'll just like hand stuff back to people and be like, no, 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 Paris, I'm not done. No, no, no. So yeah, she's not, she doesn't have it in her to inspire people and to make them better because they want to be better. It's more just like, this sucks and it's a reflection on me. And that's her main concern. So not the strongest leadership. But I feel like I'm more or less done with what I wanted to say about the Chilton years, but I'll just like cap off my thoughts on that by saying that like it almost felt like the paper wasn't as much of a presence in those first couple of seasons. Obviously, there's like nothing in season 1 except a couple brief mentions. And then there's a couple paper-related storylines like Nick and Norris and Nancy. And then we have the Stars Hollow, Richard and Stars Hollow episode when Paris wants to expose the seedy underbelly of Stars Hollow. There's that part. And there's like the other odd mention of stuff. It's just sort of like these conversations that she has with Paris and Madeline and Louise in the hallway, as opposed to like truly being a big plot point or something that we see Rory working through and learning about. It's only like one of many things. You know, we have the academic side, we have the student council issues in season 3, which kind of pushes the paper stuff to the back burner. And so it's like, it's just sort of sprinkled in here and there, and maybe there's not enough of a focus on it for a character whose sole ambition in life is to be a journalist. Maybe we just needed a little bit more of it. It was more about the interpersonal drama than about Rory building towards being a great journalist. And so maybe that's where things failed, is that like the focus wasn't in the right place for Rory. She was too worried about the teenage drama of it all, instead of truly putting the nose to the grindstone and making herself an adaptable journalist.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we saw enough of it from her Chilton years, and I can understand why, because it just wasn't a relevant enough plot point to warrant the same sort of screen time as opposed to relationships that are going on with Rory, but also with Lorelai. I mean, it's not just the Rory show, it's the Lorelai show as well. But I think from what we saw in her years at the Franklin and her time at the Franklin, just echoing something that you've already said, the warning signs were there that Rory is not cut out for journalism. And so that is my takeaway, at least from what we did get, is just that, oh no, you're thinking of pursuing this in college and making this your career path, and please pick something else, because this is not going to end well for you. And it doesn't. It doesn't.
Yeah. Anything else on Chilton for you?
Nope.
Okay. Because on that note, now I think it's a good time to talk about why Yale. You know, I've got my Rory's going to Yale shirt on, but like, Yale doesn't have a journalism school, at least not at the undergraduate level. It's sort of like you take communications courses through the English department. And obviously Yale on the whole is a reputationally superior school to many, you know, like it is Ivy League. It is world renowned in many disciplines. But, you know, we have this talk of Rory the whole first couple of seasons, Harvard, 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 and then it turns into Yale, and it's just like, we're too focused on like, oh, this is the best school in the world, instead of who has the best journalism program. And I feel like they missed opportunities to have Rory go somewhere that actually makes more sense. And I think the obvious choice would have been Columbia. Like, their journalism school is named after Pulitzer. Like, he was the guy who founded the journalism school. And, you know, Rory wants to work for the New York Times. She wants to live in New York City and be that big city journalist. why not send her to Columbia? It's not that far from Connecticut. I know that, like, you know, the Yale thing became a convenience in terms of the plot. And also there's the whole Richard legacy thing. But obviously, like, the writers are the ones who control where Richard went to school. There could have been ways around that or whatever. And it's just like, it makes more sense for her to go to, like, the best journalism program in the country. And, you know, Columbia, for, like, from what I gather, Columbia's program is not only world renowned, but also highly criticized and controversial in some ways. And so, you know, it may not be perfect, but Columbia is still an Ivy League institution. And, you know, it was sort of this trailblazer in terms of providing journalism education formally like that. And so it would have made more sense to me if Rory was, like, obsessed with this idea of moving to New York and going to Columbia instead of Harvard, of all places. Again, Harvard's, like, not even on the map for journalism. So why Harvard? I don't understand it.
I don't either. I will say my vote for Rory, maybe, and just because it was, like, the area that I grew up in, so I'm more familiar with it. NYU, girl. Like, you could have cakewalked your way into there. Like, she had the credentials, she had the grades. I have no doubt in my mind whatsoever that she would have just, her application arrives, like, the admissions board just opens the envelope and they're just like, yep, thank you. Okay, send out the acceptance letter. I just saw one sentence that it was all I needed to know. I think she would have just been admitted there in a heartbeat. And I feel like that would have been a really good place for her to be, because you have Wall Street, you have an entire financial district, you have, you know, just raging politics right and left. Like, New York City is one of, like, the heartbeats of America. Like, so much is always going on there. So again, whether it's politics, whether it's finance, whether it's education, whether it's, you know, even just anything, domestic affairs, foreign affairs, you're always going to find something to write on, even within, like, the confines of the borough of Manhattan. So if you really want to advance your career, I understand that, like, your grandfather went to Yale. There's an expectation that you're going to follow in those footsteps, which I think is why that was always an appeal to Rory as well, for wanting to please Richard. But you have to think in terms of, like you said, what you want your career path to be. What educational institution is going to allow me to be the most successful at that? And Yale wasn't it. So it made sense from a plot standpoint, with, like, within the Gilmore household and the legacy, for her to go there. But from Rory's journalistic capacity and her expectations for making that a career, it never made any sense. Go to New York, go to Los Angeles, go to London, go to Tokyo, go to Paris, even European or Asian countries where there's, like, a really predominant city. Study abroad. I'm sure they have also multiple institutions that could allow you to be successful in that. There's always going to be something to report there. There's always something going on. But confining yourself to going to Yale just because it looks good on paper, but, like you said, doesn't have the most reputable journalistic program, if that's what you want, it doesn't have to always be what looks most shiny. It has to be what is going to be most good, like, the most successful career path for you and the most successful choice for you to make down, like, in the long run.
Yeah, she says she wants to travel and see things, and she doesn't even mention the idea of studying abroad. Like, that would have been the obvious choice. And yeah, like you said, London would have been perfect. And obviously we have some travels to London later on, but for unrelated things. And so, yeah, that's something I hadn't even really thought about, but makes so much sense. Like, if you want to travel, like, go do other things, but she can't be away from mommy for too long. And I think that's, you know, another thing that goes to her whole not being cut out for this kind of conversation, you know, like, she won't even go off to California at the end of the show with Logan. I think partly because the idea of living on the other side of the country scares her more than she likes to let on. And, you know, the following Obama around on the campaign trail is one thing, because campaigns ultimately come to an end at some point. There's some finality to that eventually, right? But moving to California with Logan, not necessarily, right? And so obviously she kind of moves off from her mom's after the fact and moves to Queens eventually, somehow, some way. Or no, to Brooklyn. And still, you know, 2 hours away from her mom. It's probably like as far as she'd ever want to go. Excellent point that studying abroad would have made sense. Yeah, on the whole, there wasn't enough consideration of what actually made sense for her. And I think her career suffered for it. Yeah, but I mean, the point was always for her career to suffer. So it's like, oh.
Yeah. And I mean, there are a lot of really, really just noteworthy colleges and universities within the United States that will take their journalism students and send them overseas, because that's where the story is. That's where the reporting is going to happen. I am not saying take Rory Gilmore and throw her into like the middle of Iran or Iraq, where like Al-Qaeda and just, you know, terrorist groups are raging, and put any sort of student, Rory, anyone else included, otherwise, into a very dangerous situation where, you know, just things can happen. We don't need to go there. But maybe something is going, like, you know, maybe like the United Nations is having a council in Geneva, Switzerland that needs to be reported on. Send her there to report on it. That's how these kids are going to learn. And I feel like there are a lot of institutions within the United States that do have programs like that, where they're going to say, we're going to send you abroad because we're going to send you to where the story is, because that's how you are going to become a better journalist and a better reporter. Yale was not going to be the school that did that best for her.
Yeah, I think when they're doing the pro-con lists for schools, and not one of them mentions the strength of the journalism program. It's just like, how many janitors do they have? You know, proximity to mommy. Those are the determining factors, right? Whereas we, like, again, Yale does not have a journalism school, which means like there's no established program that is, you know, cohesive and coherent unto itself, which may mean that the school does not have the kind of faculty that you might want to have teaching those courses. Those, like, the best of the best are probably at these schools that have a stronger focus on journalism and have a strong program. That's why the program is so strong. But here it's just like, take a bunch of like English courses and political rhetoric courses and, you know, philosophy. Good enough, right? You know, what kind of facilities do these schools have? Like, do they have anything beyond a school paper? Most universities have a paper, but like, what other opportunities might exist at a school that has a focus on journalism in the way of like broadcast journalism, which seems to be what Rory wants to do? And then, you know, the other like thought there is the alumni network. You know, if Yale doesn't really have a journalism program, then the alumni network from Yale might have the odd person who goes on to be a great journalist, but it's not going to be the same as these other schools that have like frameworks in place to bring in mentors and alumni who are working in the field to assist students through these early days of their career path. And so she's putting herself at a disadvantage by, like you said, going for what looks good on paper, even if that school doesn't have the best resources for her. And on top of that, she's probably paying more for an Ivy League institution and could have paid less to go somewhere else and get an even better education in her field. You know, obviously a Yale education is still a great education, obviously. but at what cost? Literally, at what cost? And, you know, if she wanted to be in Boston, why Harvard? Why not Emerson or BU? Because those schools both apparently have great journalism programs. Like, it just, yeah. It kind of galls me how little Lorelai and Rory seem to have researched this and thought about it. It was just like Harvard or bust from day one.
Yeah, and then Yale, because also a pro-con list. But you make an excellent point. I'm not saying send Rory to, like, the mountains of Montana or to, like, the cornfields of Kansas, where, like, you know, she's going to get swept away in a twister with Dorothy and end up in Oz. But go to a major city, Northwestern, UCLA, like you said, BU, any private liberal arts program or school is going to probably have like a good path for you to take. It doesn't have to be Yale, and it shouldn't have been. And even if she had considered maybe one of those other schools as well, get a scholarship. They probably want someone like you to go there who's going to be successful and have like a good solid career, and then be an alumni that's like, hey, in the same way that, like, oh my gosh, like Christiane Amanpour, world-class journalist, like fantastic. You go to Northwestern, you make a career. Northwestern is going to boast and say, you know what, Rory Gilmore went here. Like, you probably could have, she could have probably even, like, had she really done her homework with Lorelai, either gotten like a full 4-year ride somewhere, or even just like a partial scholarship where you didn't have to pay for the entire thing. Excellent point there as well. You probably could have like offset and saved a lot of money just looking into a scholarship path, because people would have looked at you and saw your Chilton grades, saw your credentials, and said, I want her to come here. Let's offer her something.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, Ivy Leagues have an interesting financial aid system where those who get in often get quite a bit of financial aid, as long as they can prove the financial need, right? It's merit based ish. Like if you're good enough to get in, you're good enough for them to pay for you to be there, unless your parents make a gajillion dollars, right? I don't know exactly how all that works, because I don't think anything like that exists in Canada, but yeah. So, but either way, like you said, there might have been more opportunities for particular scholarships or grants or something for her to study elsewhere based on her academic performance. So good points. But moving on a little bit, speaking of Yale, let's move on to the Yale Daily News and talk about what I think is truly the beginning of Rory's villain arc, which is Die Jerk.
Yep.
Yeah, she's kind of awful in that episode. I think up until the end of season 3, she still maintains that like plucky spirit and that good girl attitude that made people love that character in the first place. But then by season 4, when she's at Yale, something happens and she just starts to go downhill a little bit. So talk to me about your take on the whole interaction with Doyle and the ballerina, and just sort of the fallout from, you know, Doyle's advice to like write what she thinks and to be unflinching, and how all of that is impacting Rory here in this early part of season 4.
Yeah, I support Doyle's advice that he gave to Rory in terms of be more candid. Your writing is boring. Like, you can do all of the homework for any sort of topic that you're given, which I'm sure Rory did, but it just falls back to like, in the same way when she was writing for the Franklin and you're writing about a parking lot, she's like, oh, I'm going to go read up about like the origins of concrete. Great. Glad you're doing your homework here. But I feel like she stepped into the Yale Daily News with that same mindset, where any assignment that Doyle gave her was going to be one where she was just like, okay, well, let me, you know, break open my like encyclopedia, or just, you know, crack into a book and do my research on it. And she was presenting articles to Doyle to be published that's just, they're factual based, and it's just like, okay, but you're just reciting facts. You're not telling me anything new. There's nothing refreshing about this. Where is the Rory insight? I want to hear Rory Gilmore's voice in this piece, not just that 2 + 2 = 4. I want to hear what you have to say. And I feel like so those early articles that she was presenting were being rejected by Doyle for that reason, because he's like, you're not in this piece. It's just you're writing down facts in paragraph form that you then expected to be published. I want to hear more about what you think. Give me your opinion. Give me your insight. And that's what Doyle was pushing her to do. And that's why he said, we'll file your earlier pieces, but they're not going to get published because it's boring. I don't want to read it. There's nothing there that's unique. And so when she finally gets to having to review the ballet, Lorelai did not do her any favors there in terms of the critiques that Lorelai was making, because she ended up taking a lot of what her mother said and inserting that into the piece. But I think she took what Doyle said and she went too far in the other direction. And look, I'll be the first person to admit, ballet is not for me either. That's not something that I would want to sit through. I probably would also just not enjoy it. It's for some people, not for everybody. But I feel like maybe Rory took what Doyle was saying and just went too far, as if to say, if you love it, gush on it. If you hate it, tear it to pieces. And so Rory had Lorelai in her ear saying, this is horrible. Maybe the ballet probably was honestly not great. It seems like it might not have been. But then she wrote a piece that was just eviscerating this lead ballerina and the entire production. There was also fat shaming in there that was just super not great. Like, that needed to never be a thing. But she just basically wiped the floor of this entire production in terms of what she wrote. And of course, Doyle is going to come back and say, yeah, I love it. This is exactly what I wanted you to do, because it's finally hearing Rory's voice. But it's hearing Rory's voice gone too far off the deep end.
Yeah, that conversation she has with Doyle is so interesting to me, where she's like, is this some kind of hazing? I put a lot of time into this. Is it something personal? Did I do something to offend you? And it tracks for me that, like, her reaction to Doyle's remarks is like, she goes straight to him not liking her or her doing something wrong, as if her articles couldn't possibly require such notes. You know, like, there must be something awry here. This must be hazing. He must be doing this on purpose to, like, test me, because obviously my piece must be so good. And it's like, no, sometimes you're just not good at stuff, right? Like, get over it. She doesn't even look at his notes or criticisms as he's sitting there marking it up before assuming he has some sort of ulterior motive or a vendetta against her personally. So, yeah, but I totally agree that, you know, the opinion and the voice that comes through in this article is a lot of Lorelai's, which is very interesting, where it's just like, Doyle told you to have an opinion and you just, like, cribbed one from your mom. It's no wonder Christopher accused, Lorelai of influencing Rory in Haunted Leg. Like, this is another example of it. Rory is like a sponge for her mom's ideas and opinions, whether she thinks she is or not. And it's almost like she needs to decondition herself to recognize when she's doing it. I know she's smart enough to formulate her own opinions, but there are just times when it's like, you took that straight from your mom.
Yeah. And even, like, it also speaks to me as well when Lorelai eventually reads the article, knowing that Lorelai didn't like the ballet. But even Lorelai's like, damn, girl, this is harsh. Like, you tore her apart. Like, this is actually mean. Like, it's one thing to hear, and she says, like, it's one thing to hear, like, your meanness come out verbally. It's another thing to read it on paper. But damn, if you didn't, like, just peg both of them. Like, I almost just want to read the entire article for myself and be like, what exactly was the full context of this? Because obviously it just sounds like it was an article that wasn't meant to be critical of a production, even in a constructive way. It was just a teardown piece. And that's not what journalism is meant to be. And so Doyle may have loved it because it's like, oh, my writer is finally giving me something that's a breath of fresh air. But Doyle was not doing Rory any favors in that either, with just saying like, oh, I love it, it's great, and not addressing the fact that like, actually, you're just kind of being a jerk with this article. And I think Rory, from what we saw, probably was. And it was an article that was probably written too harshly, that was just too mean, not so much about the ballet, but just about tearing somebody in a production down because you think it's what your editor wants to read.
Yeah. The episode is called Die Jerk for a reason, because Rory is a royal jerk. And so, Rory tries to retract the article or at least try to make a change to it and republish it to be less harsh. And Doyle's like, no, this is what journalism is. It's hurting people's feelings is what we do. It's something that he said. And I'm like, okay, sure. When you write for the Yale Daily News, you're a real journalist. If you can't handle it, leave the paper. And in one sense, I see what he's getting at. You can't always give unceasing praise, especially when something is bad. Sometimes your opinions and revelations will hurt people. And you do have to be able to handle that and contend with it. But it's another thing to unnecessarily be brutal in reporting or reviewing, because that misses the point. It's not about hurting people. It's about being honest, and it's about being critical in a way that is constructive. And I think the way that he phrased his advice to her here encourages her worst impulses. She really takes it to heart, and the rest is history from here. So, I just think that it's not helpful, the advice that he gives her necessarily. He's not wrong in the sense that, like, yeah, sometimes what you reveal in an article is not always going to be good for people. But the way the writers are using Doyle as a way to express their views on journalistic criticism is a little concerning to me.
Yeah, I agree. And it seems like from the end of that episode, in particular in Die Jerk, Rory she hasn't learned a lesson, because her next assignment is to review like a musical concert. We go into like that episode ends, which I will say, the way that they constructed that, with that episode ending with just what even to me just sounds like a horrible rendition of Michael Rode the Boat of Shore. Like, I'm listening to that at the end of that episode being like, oh my gosh, if I was sitting at this concert right now, I would also probably wanting to be pulling my hair out if that was the first 10 seconds of what I was hearing. I think it was written that way because they were trying to set up Rory with another like, oh my gosh, this is horrible. Here, she's about to write another horrible critique and horrible written piece about this, because it's an actual legitimate, like, horrible performance. Why not end that episode with Rory going to like a symphony or like an orchestral concert where it's like she's all of a sudden smitten with what she's hearing? But I think it was written that way as if to say, this girl has not learned her lesson. She's just about to once again wipe the floor with these musicians, with these singers. Doyle will probably love it, but she's not progressing as a journalist here, because she's, again, just about to say, this concert sucks, I hated it, instead of trying to like find some sort of constructive criticism or an appreciation to it. It was just, there was no learning curve to be had for Rory in that episode. And I think the writers ended it purposefully as if to say, she still has not learned here.
Quite possibly. That's kind of a take that I didn't consider. I thought it was more just them poking fun at college level performers who think they're good and are not good. And that, maybe it does show that Rory is in for a lot of assignments that she's not necessarily going to like, obviously some of the assignments she gets at the beginning of her time at the Yale Daily News are not her thing. She's talking to her mom just before the ballet starts about how, her last assignment was about lacrosse, which she had never even heard of until she went to cover it for the paper. And, apparently that article went over pretty well. And she's like, I guess this is the only thing I'm capable to report on because, Doyle loved that and he hated this last one. So, but I do think you're right that by the end of this, she hadn't learned the lesson, or the lesson that she took away was that it's okay to hurt people. That's what we do here. We're critical, but criticism is like a whole field unto itself. Reviewing is a whole career that people take on. And, there is a right way to do a good negative review. And, it's usually something that requires a lot of nuance and specificity about how and why things are wrong instead of just making personal attacks, dogpiling about something that you don't like, reveling in negativity. Like, she called her or likened her to a drunken dock worker. How does that even occur to her? Did she get that from a movie? I don't know. But the fact that that's the kind of journalism and criticism that's being encouraged and validated. And it makes me wonder if the writers know anything about criticism. She doesn't do a good job with this piece, but still gets praise and encouragement from Doyle, and it still gets published. And it's just what kind of message is that sending? And it makes me wonder if she's not taking any journalistic ethics courses because yowza.
Probably not.
Yeah. I think it's in this episode where we do start to see Rory's true character coming out a little bit, where it's just she's no longer playing the good, nice girl. Now that she's trying to compete in a bigger pool, the gloves are coming off a little bit. And some of her darker impulses of entitlement and mean-spiritedness are bubbling to the surface. And it's where we truly start to see this coming out, this side of her.
I would agree. I don't think Lorelai. I don't think Rory has learned any lessons throughout that entire episode. I don't think she really learns even substantial lessons at her time as writer and editor of the Yale Daily News that allow her to be successful in her career path moving forward. We'll touch about that more when we get to another episode on her post-Yale years, her internship, her career path afterwards, trying to get internships, working for Naomi, just trying to break into that field. But I think she's unsuccessful then because she doesn't learn enough now. And, you can call it both ways. I think there is something to be said for the fact that she doesn't grow enough in her time at Yale because she doesn't put in the work to make herself a better writer and make herself a better journalist and do better. I mean, she spends an entire summer doing who knows what with Emily in Europe. Those are months that you could have spent. Maybe have a summer internship instead. Write freelance for even just a mom and pop production somewhere, or a publication. But I feel like Rory was this is another example of silver spooning and just expecting things to be handed to you down the line. But you can't expect to be a world-class journalist and be successful in that way if you don't put in the time and if you don't put in the work. And if you're not open to criticism. And so I don't think that Rory ever learned enough from Doyle, from her own experiences as a writer at her time at Yale, to ever be successful or for that input to be beneficial enough and constructive enough for her to be successful as a writer down the line. So in a way, she screwed herself, but she also didn't have adequate leadership that was ever going to allow her to get to where she needed to be. The problem was twofold. You didn't have enough mentorship, but you also didn't have enough personal motivation. And at the end of the day, those two things just damned you from ever having this be a career path that you could excel in.
Yeah, I was just going to make that same point. about her going off to Europe with Emily. She calls Lorelai in a panic, being like, I'm so behind at the paper. And of course, Lorelai's like, you're catch-up girl, not to be confused with ketchup girl, because you're purely mustard and relish from day one. But like, this assumption that Rory can do anything if she just puts her mind to it. But she essentially, I mean, obviously travel is not necessarily wasted time, but when it comes to thoughtfully using her summers to do internships or personal research or whatever it takes to get her ahead, and the fact that it doesn't even cross her mind because she's so wrapped up in her own personal drama, as I said earlier, that it goes to show that maybe it's not her number one priority, and that should be a red flag to her that something is not right here. So the fact that she was freaked out by that is a big indicator of her level of dedication. And then she's made features, like a features writer anyway. And then we get her coming to Doyle with all of these ideas at the beginning of season 5. But like, I have so many ideas for articles, and most of them are just derivative and boring until she comes across the Life and Death Brigade. And it just sort of like pulls her back into feeling confident again, because she writes this great article that, she makes a connection and gets an inside scoop on something that people have been trying to uncover for decades. And I love that episode where Logan calls her all the way out. I just love it so much. Like all of the names that he lists off. Like, I also love what it says about Logan, just like how much he knows about this field and how that makes him such a good match for her. Like he knows what she knows and like can match her on that level. And he's got all the connections that she could ever want, and he encourages her to get involved, get dirty, like you need to participate. She says to him, I'm here as an observer. Journalists do not participate, which is just absolutely not true. It shows that she fundamentally misunderstands this thing that she said she's wanted to do her entire life. And Logan lists off the names of people who got right in there, and he calls her out on being scared. Says she needs a little adventure. And he's like, some people can live 100 years without really living for a minute. You climb up here with me, it's one last minute you haven't lived. And I love that moment. And then jumping off the scaffolding and everything, it's just, that's why I've got my In Omnia Paratus mug on the go today, because it's such a turning point, I think, for her. Not only in her life, but in her journalism, because I think it opens her up to a whole world that she didn't even really know existed, and it made her a little more adventurous.
Okay. Spinning off of that, I just have a broad general question that I now want to pitch you. Logan was a member of the Yale Daily News. He didn't contribute as well as Doyle wanted him to. Was given assignments that he just kind of like shrugged off and laughed off. We'll talk about, him saving the paper, with coming into, just at the 9th hour, getting like a print time. But the question that I want to pose to you now is that, do you feel that Logan inhibited Rory in terms of her journalistic capacities? Like, did he ever do anything that was just positive for her in terms of allowing her to succeed? Or did, and this kind of ties into like the 9th hour, saving the Yale Daily News from like not having a print time sort of thing, which we'll talk about, was his hand holding and maybe some sort of like nepotism inhibiting Rory from growing as a journalist? Or do you think he was actually like a positive influence for her in terms of allowing her to like have that insight into the LDB? I guess, was Logan bad or good for Rory in terms of her journalistic career?
I want to say good. I think he, like I said, opened her up to new experiences and ways of thinking about the profession that she hadn't considered before. She was very much so like tunnel vision on this is how journalism is done and this is how I intend to operate. And he was like, no, there's like so much more here for you to partake in. And I think that was really good for her. And, obviously, nepotism makes the world go round. It just does. It's who you know. And he knows a lot of people, and his dad knows a lot of people. And so, Rory would never have gotten that internship at the Stanford Eagle Gazette without Logan's connection and his dad buying that paper. And, it was through Logan that she met Hugo Gray, who gave her the job on the Obama campaign trail. So he connected her to a lot of things she otherwise might not have had. And he was always supportive of her ambitions. He never tried to hold her back or say, like, this isn't the right thing for you. He was just always like, no, keep on with it. I'm not going to tell you to stop. You love school. I want you to go back to school. Be careful working for my dad, but I'm not going to tell you not to, So I think on the whole, he was a net positive for her. And Mitchum was also the one who got her that meeting with Condé Nast at the end in the revival. Like, without the Huntsbergers, she was not doing a good enough job of getting her own stuff. And so I think it goes to what Mitchum was saying about her at the end of season 5, which we'll go totally more in depth on in that episode. But like, think about where she would be without them. Would she be anywhere? Would she have gotten anything? Would she have, again, the grit to go after these things without that connection and that support? Probably not.
I agree. Yeah, I would just echo that, saying Logan did a lot of good for her. But the nepotism that I think she was also picking up from and learning from and seeing within him also kind of just, I think, again, she was just constantly spoon-fed this reality and this idealization that my name and financial resources will allow me to get to where I want to be. And Mitchum called her out on it. We'll talk about it in another episode, but that's the flaw of Rory Gilmore with journalism, is that she never understood that it was going to take work and betterment to make herself be a successful and more eye-opening writer to get her to where she wanted to be. And that's, I think, why she failed and why this career path was, again, just never good for her, because she could never understand that there were steps she could take to be a more opinionated writer and to be a more well-rounded writer. And when you're not open to criticism and to that betterment, you are going to fail. Mitchum saw it. We'll talk about it. I think, Doyle saw it. I even think Charleston saw it. Again, going back to her Franklin days. The writing was on the wall for her with this. But I don't want to, belittle that point too much.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing, where the writing was on the wall well before Logan ever came onto the scene. And I don't think she would have made it as far as she did in journalism without the boost that she got from knowing him. So that's how I feel about that. But we've been going for quite some time, and I definitely think we need to talk about the Howell raising of Paris, with her being elected the new editor while Rory was out of school, and just, the hurt that Rory felt about that, and then having to come back to the paper and see the toxic environment created by Paris and how people were reacting to that, and how now she had to balance, what she thought was best for the paper with trying to be kind to Paris and trying to get Paris to see the light. So how did you feel about Rory kind of going behind Paris's back with the rest of the staffers and having that meeting about her editorship? Like, and was the Howell Rainsing justified in your view? I feel like I know what your answer is going to be, but I gotta ask.
Can we count it down 3, 2, 1, and then just say yes or no in terms of whether or not we feel it was justified?
Sure.
Okay.
3,
2,
2, 1. Yes.
Yes. 1,000%. I'm sorry, Paris. I love you. But you were running that paper into the ground. And it was for reasons that I've already mentioned previously. Too type A, too micromanaging, too big brother. You entrust your writers to bring you content and articles that you want to publish. But then if a sentence is off, or if a punctuation is off, if there's like,
if an infinitive is split,
anything, you're just going to be like, nope, get rid of it, get it out of my site. I don't want to see that photograph. I don't want to see that article. I will rewrite it. It's why I think she bunkered herself away, because she was just like, nobody at this paper is ever going to do a good enough job as I can do. So I am just going to sit in here and just take on all of the work and take on all of the responsibility and churn this out myself. It was 1,000% justified for the other members of the Yale Daily News, Rory included, to go behind her back for, again, lack of better phrasing, but that is what they did, as if to say, like, look, we have a newspaper tyrant here, and it's the Yale Daily News has hit an iceberg, and we're sinking. We don't have enough lifeboats to sustain us unless we get like a new editor-in-chief up in here. Paris had to go at that point in time. And Rory, I think, like, I love her for it. She did the best that she could, as if to say, like, listen, she goes into the bunker and she's like, listen, we've been friends for 5 years. It took us time to even build up this friendship, but now that we've established it, we're loyal to one another. We've been there for one another. But I've got to tell you, you're running this ship into the ground. Your staff is unhappy with you. They're disappointed. This is not okay anymore. And I've come here to tell you that, like, you've been ousted. It was a good friend moment because she was being truthful, but because she was also just saying, like, look, Paris, you've got to recognize your own flaws here and why you brought this about. And you have to recognize that you also, in a way, kind of did this to yourself. And so I think that was what allowed Paris to leave the bunker and say, like, okay, I get it. Like, I kind of accept this. I was not good enough. I'm sorry. Until Rory then gets appointed editor. And then that, plays out with, she's just like, oh, well, now I'm going to evict you and put all your crap out in the hallway but case in point, Paris did this to herself, and Rory was just being a good friend in that moment to say, like, listen, I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to support you, but you should have done better here. And this is going to be the end result of this. We'll work through it.
Yeah, I think Rory was in the right here. Obviously, the board was not happy. And, without Rory's presence there, it might have been even worse for Paris. And so the fact that Rory was able to mediate between the board and Paris and at least try to explain before ish hit the fan, she went to Paris and said, hey, the staff is unhappy and the environment you've created here is getting toxic. I've talked with them and I wanted you to know. I feel like that was her learning her lesson from the Francie days. Finally, Rory Gilmore learns a lesson that going behind Paris's back is going to end poorly for her. So there's that. And, it's not Rory's job to let Paris get away with this. The whole no man is an island, but this woman is attitude that Paris had when it came to the paper was degrading the quality of the paper. Everybody was sort of saying, like, to add insult to injury, every time she rewrites her own rewrites, it gets worse. And then things are falling through the cracks. And So not only are people not being respected, but the quality of the work is suffering and Paris is suffering, and it's not good for anyone. As I was saying, when it came to her being the editor of the Chilton paper, it's more like it's a power struggle in her mind. She revels in being in charge of things and commanding and directing others. But when the efforts of the people she's instructing fall short of the standards that she has in mind, she doesn't take time to communicate what she's looking for and what she's expecting. She just shoots everything down and deems it to be a lackluster effort, then takes no responsibility when the paper isn't nearly as good as it could be. And like, that's her ineffectual leadership on display. She blames others for their shortcomings and never bothers to truly reckon with like how she was the reason for the downfall in the first place.
Yeah, exactly. And then again, just going forward to Rory taking over the paper, she just sees it as like a coup d'etat and not, you were honestly a bad editor, and the Yale Daily News has nominated and elected someone to this position that they feel like could be better. I'm just going to flag this as my best friend undermined me. Like, and you just cast blame now on your best friend instead of acknowledging your shortcomings, like you said.
Yeah. And, you know, obviously Rory ultimately saves the Yale Daily News that one time that it's almost going to not come out. You know, D-Day happened, paper still came out. Kennedy got shot, paper still came out. A couple months of the reign of Kaiser Geller, and the whole thing is about to crumble. And, you know, obviously we have Logan stepping in to help there and him flexing the Huntsberger muscle, if you will, using his name and his connections to get their printing spot back. Which, you know, I don't love it, but I do love that he kind of shows up and snaps into action and is just like, I know the economic jargon. I'll take that. I'll type that in. I type 90 words a minute. Like, and he knows what he's doing and he jumps into action. And even though it's not something that he personally cares about, he does it for Rory because he sees how important this is for her and how important it is to the rest of this group. And he finally sort of, you know, gets on board, even though it wouldn't be his choice of his way to spend that evening. He wanted to have a nice date with Rory, and instead he's bailing the paper out of a sticky situation. But at the end of the day, he shows up for Rory. He shows up for the Yale Daily News, and I applaud him for that.
I concur. I have similar sentiments. I don't love nepotism in general. I mean, obviously it's abhorrent, but I feel like he was doing it for Rory as like a, you know, impress the girl tactic, but also just for the benefit of the paper as well, because he does have an appreciation for the printed word. I mean, his father publishes 12, 13 newspapers, oversees all of those. I think he was recognizing that this is what needs to happen. You know, he, like you said, had the jargon to be able to talk to Russell and say, like, listen, hey, you know, it's Logan here, Mr. Huntsberger, give us our spot back. I think he really did it for the greater good, because when you see him say, like, that's how it's done here, and he's reveling in that with all of the other members of the Yale Daily News, and they're all just so elated over the fact that this paper is going to be published, it wasn't self-serving or self-motivated. Yeah, maybe it was like, again, like, I'm just trying to impress my, you know, girlfriend as well in this moment in time, but it was a greater good moment. And I think it was a solid thing that Logan did there. And I applaud him for it.
Yeah, exactly. Who do you think was the best editor of the Yale Daily News and why? Paris, Doyle, Rory, those are the three that we know. Like, I feel like Paris is automatically out, given all we just said.
Okay, well, I have my 1, 2, 3. I feel like we're going to have the same 1, 2, 3.
Maybe. I'm quite torn between Doyle and Rory, but I think I have an answer. So give me your go like 3, 2, 1.
Okay,
Worst to best.
3 being the worst.
Yeah.
Okay. Paris, Rory, Doyle.
Interesting. I think I'm Paris, Doyle, Rory.
Interesting. Okay.
Mostly because when Rory is editor, we see how like good she is with people, and when she leaves, Joni says to her like, I only joined the paper because, I wanted to meet cute guys. But when I saw you handling this job with so much like grace and professionalism, you inspired me to want to be a journalist as well. And generally when we see her interacting with the people at the paper, she's doing a really good job of keeping everybody on track and giving out assignments fairly and giving out criticism fairly and kindly. And other than that time she's mad at Logan and is passive aggressively like not printing his article and like taking over his work and whatnot, like with everybody else, she seems to be a very capable and fair leader. Whereas Doyle seems to have a little bit of like an ego trip at times and maybe doesn't have, like I said earlier, the best advice or the best mentality about the whole thing. And it feels like it's kind of another accolade for him as well. Whereas with Rory, it's just like, it feels like she finally starts to come into her own more. She's gone through this struggle and she's come out the other side and she's applying that sort of newfound strength to this leadership role that ultimately does feel like a good fit for her. Whereas Doyle is just sort of like, he was trying to be too much of a hard ass maybe at times and was trying to be too edgy. Whereas Rory was just like, we're here, we're professional, we're getting it done. This is how I choose to lead.
Yeah, I mean, I can see that. I think I would give top billing to Doyle because he didn't sugarcoat things. And I think that was important in that profession. We go back to like him telling Rory, like, listen, sometimes your writing is not going to be great. Like, not every piece is going to be a home run. Try again next time. He didn't immediately oust her from the paper when her first effort was just subpar and not going to be published. Not even the second time. He just said, listen, you're just not getting there with the writing. Keep trying. And he offers her those attempts to keep trying. And it's when Rory says, well, is this a personal attack? Like, is this hazing? Like, when she can't take it as constructive criticism, that's when that's when Doyle says, like, hey, if you can't hack this, then maybe leave the paper because this isn't the position for you. And I feel like it just so strongly echoes and directly parallels what Mitchum notices as well when he's like, I don't think you got it. And I think that Doyle maybe was noticing like, hey, she doesn't fully have it. I'm giving her attempts to try and be better and get her there instead of just saying like, you don't have a spot on this paper anymore. But I think that was, and I think it's a good thing for any editor to do, to say like, listen, not great, do better next time. Keep trying to improve. When I think Rory was, again, she's a good mentor, she's a good leader, which is why I think, just fast forwarding, I think Charleston also recognizing like, hey, you could actually be like a really good teacher, because in a position of authority, when you're trying to instruct others and teach others, you're actually really good at it. And I think that genuinely Rory is a good teacher, but she's not always the best student. And that's something that I think that, again, it was noticed in her. And so that's where I would give more credit to Doyle as a better editor than Rory, because she also needed to realize sometimes you need to be okay with telling people that their work kind of is subpar and not great. You can't handhold everybody. And I feel like Rory was maybe going to be a little bit complacent in doing that. And Doyle was going to be not like a complete hard ass, but have the edge and the backbone to say like, listen, it's nothing personal, but this is not great. Try again and do better, because I know that you can, and that capability is there.
I mean, there are a few instances we see of Rory having to give out criticism, and, I think she handles it with grace. Whereas Doyle sometimes just comes off as brash unnecessarily. And so, it's not that Rory is unwilling or unable to deliver criticism and to make tough choices. We see a few instances where she does do that and she does it well. And so I think that's why I give it to her. And we don't see when Doyle leaves. Obviously, he's there for possibly 2 years, I think, as editor, which, goes to show that he is liked and respected. But we don't see his, the end of his tenure. Obviously, he's good at what he does, and he's talented enough to sustain that and to get a job at the Current as a fact checker right away and all of that. But we don't see if he was beloved. Whereas when Rory leaves, they get her that giant pencil and they frame her last, the last issue that she edited, and they give a whole toast to her and all of that. She's not even in the running to be editor at first, but they're like, what about Gilmore? Everybody is just sort of super on board with her, which speaks to her capabilities and how much everybody respects her there. And for the most part, everything I see from her during the limited number of episodes we have of her as editor, she seems like she's doing a really good job of it and is accomplishing what she needs to without being a jerk about it, which again is growth from what we see of her in season 4 and even from Doyle. There are moments when Doyle is just unnecessarily snappy and snarky and demanding, like when he wants strawberry ice cream with no chunks of strawberry in it, or when he's yelling at Glenn or judging Rory for using the database to write the obituary for Trix, all these things. He just maybe thinks a little too highly of himself. I don't, that could just be me riffing and not having thought that through too much, but there are just definitely moments where he lets the power go to his head in a way that Rory doesn't. She's just a little more fair and judicious in the way that she administrates the paper. And I like that. And, thinking of the Voices of Young Journalism panel that she does, again, she has so much poise and speaks so well. And, she gives pompous Princeton guy a run for his money and catches flies with honey instead of vinegar, right? And so I see a lot of growth in her in that year that she's doing this. And, imagine Doyle at that panel and what kind of douchey things he would be saying and what kind of fights he would be getting in with pompous Princeton guy. Whereas Rory has found a way to sort of rise above it a little bit and deliver with a bit more humility and professionalism than Doyle was able to.
Fair enough. I mean, those are all excellent points. I wouldn't counter any of them. I think we can both agree, just at the end of the day, at least it wasn't Paris.
Yeah. Paris was the worst. Mm-hmm. Augusto Pinochet in a pantsuit. Kaiser Geller in her reign of terror. Just all of the insults of Paris from the staffers are priceless. But
yeah, Paris needed to do just fully clothed, non-nudity, but just shame walk from the bunker with a septa just ringing the bell, just being shame. But again, fully clothed. But just, you're out of office. Thank you, next.
Yeah. I do love when Rory steps down from her editorship and Paris is when I was writing the paper, I was dying to do an article about everybody's asinine obsession with boho chic, but Rory had the guts to tell me that the idea for my article was trite and passé, because that's who Rory is. Honest, direct, and to the point. When you all turned on me and decided you didn't want me in charge anymore, and you all chewed me up and spit me out, Rory was the one who broke the news to me. Thank you, Rory, for being the one person with integrity among a collection of cowardly backstabbers. And then once everybody kind of goes off to have drinks or whatever, she's just like, well, now we're both ousted leaders. Welcome to Club Nixon.
But
oh, Paris. Never change.
Nope. Never.
I feel like I still have so much more to say about journalism, but we've been going for quite some time and we can always pick this back up. I'm not sure when the second part of this will air. We'll probably give it a little breathing room and do a couple other things in between. But if you like this conversation, stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to talk about, her time with the Eagle Gazette, her interactions with her coworkers there and with Mitchum. Maybe some of the later stuff from season 7 when she's looking for jobs. And then obviously the revival when we see kind of where her career has taken her in the interim, where we left her between then and 2016. So stay tuned for that.
Yep. In the meantime, always go back and enjoy some of our older episodes. If you are in need of more GG content, there's always good stuff to be mined there. We're going to keep saying it as it gets closer and closer to the fall. FanFest is coming, y'all, October 18th through 20th in Guilford, Connecticut. Listen, there are a minimal amount of tickets left to this event. If you have not purchased one, do not wait, because they will sell out by the end of the summer. It's pretty much a guarantee that they're going to go by that point in time. We include links to that event in our description below. Go check out the website. Shoot us an email if you link to the Facebook planning page there for this event. If you love Gilmore Girls, this is the convention for you to be attending. Don't sleep on it. Don't wait to buy a ticket. We will be there. We will be hosting some panels. We would love to see you there as well. Go check that out and just please consider attending. You will not be disappointed. It is the ultimate Gilmore Girls weekend for any fan.
Yeah, I'm so excited. And on that note, before you go, if you haven't already, don't forget to hit that like button. Subscribe if you're not already. Drop us a comment. Let us know what you thought about this episode. If you want to find us on social media, we're on Instagram. Our socials and our email are linked below if you want to reach out. Don't hesitate. And on that note, we'll see you next Friday for dinner.
Arrivederci.
Ciao.